Our next speaker is Melinda Bateman. She's been farming for over 20 years near Taos, New Mexico, and since converting her organic farm to Rudolph Steiner's biodynamic method, her soil has improved, her crop health has increased, she's using reduced inputs and pest control, and irrigation needs have been lowered by 2/3. For 20 years, she's been harvesting, processing, storing, and selling produce in the Taos community, as well as teaching this biodynamic method around the world. So, and I just happen to live on her farm, and she's really great, and it's really cool to see, see all year round what's happening now. So anyway, this is Melinda Bateman.
So I just wanted to show a little bit of a visual of our farm, and then we'll quickly move on to the preservation topic that's at hand. I did want to mention that as the farm has progressed over the years, one of our goals has become to grow and store and eat our own food year-round as much as possible. So I've been experimenting and working on, preserving food for a home-scale kind of application. This was a fun aerial photo that was taken from an ultralight. Here I am. I don't know how many of you participated yesterday in the stirring ceremony. I'm a more traditional biodynamic practitioner, so I stir a little bit differently than the way we did in the ceremony, and I apply perhaps a little bit differently. And partly too because I am a production farmer. I'm really hands-on. So I have to be practical. This is actually me applying preps to the property. For certain preps, I use a backpack sprayer. I mostly just did it because it's beautiful photo. And I wouldn't choose to do this again on my farm, but probably 12 years ago, my neighbor came and rototilled the soil, and I just wanted you to get a sense of what our farm looks like and the color and tilt of our soil. Here's a couple onions. This is actually sort of a storage opportunity. You can see the onion on the left has a rather thick stem, and the onion on the right has this rather reduced or shrunken stem. The one on the left is not going to keep well. The energy from the growing process has not completely returned to the bulb or the root. And so when I'm sorting onions to store them, I keep the ones like this with a little shrunken, shriveled up, stem, and the one with the thicker stem I put in a pile to eat quicker, like to eat. There's nothing wrong with that other onion. It's just not going to keep well. So you don't want to throw that in your keeping thing. This is a photo of our garlic crop. And then this is another, maybe we'll save this slide for later. I'm a little bit old-fashioned, so I actually brought handouts. And you guys can pass these around the room. There's one titled Resources, and there's another one titled Celery and Cold Storage. So, sorry. Let's see. So there's lots of ways to store vegetables. Actually, let's see. Jay, how did you say we could get to that other slide?
Oh, the arrow keys?
No, but the other screen. Go figure. So, common ways of storing food are canning, freezing, dehydrating, celery, and then you can also ferment food. So freezing is pretty straightforward. If you have freezer space and you have food, you can just look online and see what people recommend to do to freeze food. I don't think we need to labor that point. Canning is much the same. There's a ton of information on the internet about how to can food. And if you have a room where you can, a cold room where it's not going to freeze, you can store a ton of food canned. Things that we commonly can on our farm are tomatoes. We make our own pickles. We also make a dill bean. And then, the sky's kind of the limit when you start looking on the internet. You can find like zucchini relish recipes, and if you've got something that you want to can, I just suggest you get on the internet and look. You'll find a good recipe for it. And of course, fruit cans really well. Then dehydrating can be a little more tricky. There's several, lots of choices for dehydrators. On the resources list, you'll notice that I put a resource for also a homemade solar dehydrator. Comes from a little community or project that's south of Santa Fe called, I think, Ampersand. And they've made this smashing solar dehydrator basically out of scavenged materials. You can spend 20, 30, 40 bucks on one of those, stackable white plastic dehydrators at a place like Walmart. It'll function just fine. Or you can upgrade to, I actually splurged and bought, I think it's called an cellar, and it has 9 trays, it's square, and it has a lot more temperature control or temperature settings than the little, round plastic kind that you get, locally somewhere. And I brought a few, I have some dehydrated tomatoes. The thing about dehydration, it can be a little bit labor intensive in terms of preparing, like slicing food to put in the dehydrator, but you can put a lot of different things in a dehydrator. I dehydrate zucchini, I dehydrate tomatoes, I dehydrate all kinds of fruit. And the trick with, and these are like those little sun gold cherry tomatoes, talk about a great snack. They're just like sweet and tart all at the same time. And then you'll notice on the handout I gave a description about how to make crackers. This is one of my favorite things to do with a dehydrator because you can take all kinds of stuff, like, say you have a crop of arugula that's starting to go to seed and the flavor of it's kind of sharp or strong. You'll see in the recipe, you can take like a whole, kind of like Cuisinart work bowl full of arugula and add some other ingredients to it and turn it into these delicious crackers. You can grate up stuff like zucchini, trying to think what else. I sometimes throw tomatoes in crackers like this. Just really anything you can think of, all kinds of herbs. It's really fun. They're fun to experiment. You can experiment with thickness and so on. And there's, my recipes are never exact, so the recipe in there is not exact measurements, but it's got a lot of ideas and suggestions. So, and these eat really well too. I would, suggest that you keep them someplace that's cooler than hotter because they do have flaxseed meal in them, and eventually I think if you were to keep them someplace warm, they would end up tasting kind of rancid from the oil and the flax. Let's see. And then I also have gotten accustomed to fermenting food. This is another great way to preserve food, and the fermentation also creates all of these great microbiology that's good for your gut microbiome. It's like, it's like lacto-fermented food, even though a lot of times there is no actual lactose in the product. There are different fermentation recipes that you'll find that call for whey or a tablespoon of yogurt or some lacto-based product, and I think that's why they originally were called lacto-fermented foods. But there's tons of recipes that don't call on the whey or the yogurt, and you don't have to use them actually. If you find a recipe that you particularly like, you can ignore the lacto part and the product will still ferment. Fermented foods do need to be kept cold or cool after they're finished. And I did put in my resources one of my favorite books for fermented food, actually 2 of them. There's a really great book, I don't know how many people are familiar with it, written by Sally Fallon called Nourishing Traditions. And she has a chapter on fermented food, and I believe that that's where my favorite fermented food recipe comes from. It's grated carrots with ginger and salt, and that's it. And that's a really great introductory recipe for people who are not accustomed to fermented foods. It doesn't have a strong fermentation kind of flavor, and it's rather sweet and rich. Lost it there. And then, let's let's see, I don't know what happened to, and at the very top then is really kind of the king of storage methods, which is a root cellar, right? I'm guessing that most people in this room don't have the resources or potentially the interest to dig a root cellar. It's quite an undertaking. But there are lots of ways to store food without making a root cellar. For instance, this is what I do. This is actually just some cheap cooler that's starting to literally fall apart. And you're welcome to come up here and look at it, but I'll just kind of show you. So I threw a bunch of sawdust that I got from the local sawmill in here. You could also use sand or potentially some clean straw. And I threw it in there, I buried it in there. Here's a carrot that's been in there since probably October. Now this carrot is starting to grow root hairs because the temperatures are starting to warm up. This winter, it didn't have any of these little root hairlets. It's still okay to eat it like this. The texture of the carrot might be changing a little bit with the root hairs, but there it is. And then we had a kind of a crappy crop of beets this last year, but I decided to try storing them anyway. So even these little tiny beets stored all winter long, these are perfectly firm, there's nothing wrong with them. They're really good to eat. And they're, really, in my opinion, better than anything I can buy at a grocery store in terms of flavor. Let's see if I can find another. Here's another carrot that hasn't quite put out the root hairlets. You can see it's starting to grow at top. You can just bust the top off and eat it. It's all great. Then, this is another one of my favorite storage crops. It's a parsnip. A few things about parsnips and about vegetables in general when you store them. I put some temperatures here and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Like here at the top, the carrots, the beets, the turnips, the rutabagas, they could all go together in a cooler like this or any of these other cheap cellaring techniques that I'm going to describe to you. The ideal temperature for them to stay at is somewhere between 34 and 40 degrees. And And like I said, that carrot that I showed that had the hairs on it, this has obviously gotten a little warmer than that. That's the result. Let's see what we were talking about. Oh, and then my favorite thing with parsnips is that, or my point about temperatures, about storage temperatures, is that different storage temperatures do different things to different vegetables, if you will. Like down here, the potatoes, number 5. If they get stored too cold, they'll turn all the starches in the potatoes into sugar, and they'll become these kind of insipid, overly sweet potatoes, and you won't particularly like the flavor of them. If they get too warm, they're going to sprout and get soft. So temperature matters when it comes to storage, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And like the winter squash, if you store it below 50 degrees or much above 50 degrees, it's going to grow a lot of mold and soft spots, and it won't keep well. You're going to have to throw it out. So, getting back to my parsnip example, the parsnips develop this incredible flavor that most people never get to experience if you plant them in the early summer and you actually overwinter them in the earth. And there are other vegetables that you can overwinter in the earth as well if you put them under a thick enough layer of mulch. Pretty much any of these top items, the carrots, the beets, the turnips, the rutabagas, number 1, they can also be overwintered like a parsnip under a really thick layer of mulch. But the cold makes the parsnip convert all of its starches into sugars. And spring dug parsnip is just like, there's nothing like it. I've been eating these and giving them to friends and selling a few as well lately. And, like, the other day, I cooked up 3 parsnips this size, and I had a friend over for lunch. We ate all of them in one lunch. They're just so delicious. And they're really a versatile vegetable. I think they're very underutilized. You can actually make like parsnip cake, like you make carrot cake. You can grate them and make like a parsnip slaw. You can bake them, you can roast them, you can boil them, you can add them to mashed potatoes, etc., etc. These are one of my favorite friends. Let's see, and then let's see. I think other methods for cellaring, and we'll keep talking about these other issues. So another idea or way to mimic this, I'm lucky in that I can put a cooler like this in my walk-in that's not heated in the winter months. And usually my walk-in doesn't get much below 26 degrees. So what I put in there in the cooler and in sawdust is pretty safe. If you don't have an unheated space that's gonna stay above, 24 degrees, then you gotta start getting more creative. So options for doing that in an inexpensive way are to get like a defunct refrigerator and actually dig a hole in the earth and drop the refrigerator in it. You're going to want the top of the refrigerator to more or less be level with the earth, and then you're going to want to cover the door of the refrigerator with a very thick layer of mulch. You can also drop freezers in the ground that way, and then you can build a very old-fashioned style clamp, they're referred to. And I put some references on there to some links for clamps. Some of the clamps that you'll see, like when you start researching online, are quite complicated, and some of them also are basically mounds that you build on top of the earth. For our cold climate, and especially, you're colder than we are, I would not recommend building a mound like that on top of the earth. I would definitely dig a pit, and then they line the pits with straw and put the vegetables in that way, and then there's directions for how to cover the pits. Some of the considerations for doing that are that rodents could get into a pit or a clamp like that and eat a lot of your vegetables. Micah back here was sharing with me, which is also an idea that you'll find when you look online, is burying metal trash cans. So you slope them into the earth, and then put your vegetables in the trash can. Did you use any kind of material between the vegetables, Micah?
Well, I actually put cardboard boxes lined with food grade plastic bag, and so that they're not all the weight on the bottom vegetables. But that's how I grew celery for years, which sounds so crazy and plastic, but it's breathable, and as long as I guess we're producing it, then that's what I have been doing.
Yeah. I think you could also probably layer it with straw or sand or
the only thing
or the
is
sawdust.
Sand I found pull out moisture from the roots, but that's just been my experience. So.
Yeah, that's one nice thing about putting them in this is plastic too.
Right, you can actually use those coolers or any Tupperware or some kind of plastic thing.
The other option would be to just, keep an eye on and you do need to, storage vegetables are not something that you can just throw in a cooler like this and pretend that they're not there or not look at them. Certain things are going to get soft, they're going to tend to want to, rot a little bit if what you buried isn't really prime or what you're storing. And so it's a good idea with storage foods to just every month or every 2 weeks kind of look at them a little bit and make sure that everything still looks good. Because, if something does go bad, how it is, it's going to touch its, other carrot or the other beet and then that one's going to go bad as well. So you do need to pay a little bit of attention to what you store. You can't just... And also, if you start storing in a barrel or a clamp like that, it's nice to think about how you're going to take them out and use them. I visited a CSA outside of Boulder one year where they were actually doing root crop distributions for 200 people out of a clamp. And so they would actually, they had multiple clamps. I can't remember how many they had, maybe a dozen of them, one for each week of distribution. And in each clamp, they would put X amount of turnips, X amount of beets, X amount of carrots, X amount of potatoes. So they had the clamps organized so that they could just dig up a whole clamp. And so if you were a family and you wanted to do some kind of clamp, maybe you want to organize it so the potatoes are on one side and the carrots are on one and the beets are, like that, and then figure out how to dig in and get out what you want. But you can also think about it okay, maybe every other week we're going to go take vegetables out of this clamp and move them into our refrigerator. So you might want to think about okay, how many of those vegetables would I roughly want in 2 weeks? So there's different ways to think about organizing or, how you're going to most effectively use your storage situation in terms of that. And then onions and garlic really store best at cold temperatures. They need a bit of airflow. I didn't bring any kind of demonstration, but I just throw my garlic in a crate that has lots of holes, sort of it's a plastic crate that actually I get flower bulbs in, and stack them up in this same walk-in. And garlic will actually keep down to about 28 degrees without suffering any real damage. And then the onions I tend to recycle, those red plastic net bags that you get, onions from, like that you buy 40 or 50 pounds of onions, and I tend to recycle bags like that and stick my onions in them, and also put them in my walk-in. I think you could also potentially put them in a clamp. Leeks you can also keep leeks out in your garden, probably until about Thanksgiving time, under a thick layer of mulch, and just go out to the garden and harvest them. I don't have a lot of experience with storing cabbage personally. The traditional way to store cabbage is actually to make sauerkraut, which is a fermented food. Mike has a lot more experience keeping cabbage than I do, but do you have experience keeping it where it's not refrigerated?
I keep it the way you keep those root crops.
Okay,
Carrots and the same, and they actually stay until the spring.
Yeah, I've got some, I didn't bring them, but I've got these, I didn't have a good cabbage year last year either. I had these little runty cabbages that were about this big, and I just thought for fun, I threw them in a wax paper box, and also put them in this walk-in that we're talking about. And the centers of them are still good to eat. I have to peel a lot of leaves off, but I think that's one thing about cabbage, don't be afraid, don't throw out your storage cabbage, just start taking the wrappers off. And you'll probably find a good cabbage in there.